Now, what has happened, and this is very much a part of what's going on with the left, and this is why I want to tackle this subject. What has happened is the left has focused heavily on language. And this has in large part come from linguisticians coming out of linguistics departments. And so the manipulation of meaning that we're all familiar with hinges heavily upon words and how words can be manipulated, how they can be changed. We're all familiar with the idea of political correctness, whereby once upon a time there's a word that starts with N that comes from Latin and it means black, and it gets used to describe black people. But now we're not allowed to say it anymore. What we must say instead is Negro, which also comes from Latin and also means black. And then after a time, this is decided, you know, it's a terrible thing. We have to change it yet again so that we create some new rules that everyone can be on pins and needles, wondering whether or not they're allowed to say it. And so they replace it with colored people, right? And we still have the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So it's not, you know, forbidden for me to say it. The NAACP still exists. But then we're told colored people doesn't work anymore. What we have to say is black. Now, of course, the first two words that we dispensed with, the N word, as they like to say, and Negro both mean black. Now they just say black. Then after a time, black isn't permissible. What we have to say is that they're people of color. And so we see this continuing manipulation of meaning. And it serves any number of things. They like to point at how it signifies a given thing, but what it really does is create a category of people who are terribly worried that they're always going to say the wrong thing and offend, and who look to a higher authority to help them to grasp ever more complex rules about what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say. And that approach, which clearly involves a close attention to linguistics and how to manipulate things, is the one that we have suffered the fruits of in its application to our societies. And the ivory towers of academia that have produced these people who are specialists in language, in shifting meaning, they are at the center of all the problems that we face, much like people like, you know, the Marcuse, or, you know, pull any card from the deck of Frankfurt School or those who came afterwards, or take a look, for example, at Derrida that you were discussing briefly with On the Offensive. That approach has caused us enormous damage, and everyone now is beginning to see it.
And you and I are feeling this in real time with YouTube, and anyone who uses the social media platforms is feeling this in real time, because you're constantly thinking, well, can I say that? And can I say that in that way with those words?
And what does it do?
And can I say that with those words with this implication? I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's starting, and I know it's a big cliche to say this, but it is starting to feel like we live in a, you know, communist police state at this point, where you're constantly second guessing or third guessing. Is this all right to say?
And when you say,
is this going to get the knock on my door in the middle of the night, and, you know, someone's there saying, you know, you're banned from YouTube, sucker, kind of thing.
And we know how the speech norms, you know, the conventions, the speech conventions, the expectations within a society about how you speak. And this is essentially what the forces of progress have been so focused upon, is their belief that if you control the language, you control the scaffolding for thought, and you determine how things can be thought about. And
do you think that's true? I know that Orwell has this assumption in 1984 that the words that people know, the extent of someone's vocabulary governs the range of their thought. It governs the range of possible thought. Do you agree with that?
To an extent, but that's based on the Scrabble Babble Looney Tunes side of things, where everything is text, everything is word-based reasoning. There's a certain amount of truth to it. What I want to come back to, if I may, is where you pointed out that you're constantly worried in what you say, or by what you might say, in terms of whether or not it's going to bring down the hammer of the law upon you, you know, be cast out socially. You know, people throw rocks at you until you don't move anymore. You have to wear a scarlet letter or a dunce cap. You know, you're going to be pushed out. So rather than thinking about the meaning of the words that they tell you that you have to worry about this week, look at what I laid out at the outset, which is that the rules about what you can say and how you can say it become so deeply ingrained in people's concerns that before they think, to say nothing of before they act, a pause has been foisted upon us between impression or experience and speech or action. So essentially, I look at this as a war upon instinct. If you're walking down the street and you see 3 persons of color and it's midnight, you're first going to think, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to think. You're instinctively going to feel an impulse in many cases, certainly not all, you will feel an impulse to cross the damn street. But with that impulse comes that moment, that signal jamming that they so favor, which causes you to begin to stomp all over your dick and get tangled in your own underwear, trying to figure out whether or not it's a right thing or a wrong thing that you do. They've inserted the slow nature of the mental processes associated with word-based reasoning into what is otherwise an almost instantaneous and unconscious or subconscious, if not unconscious, drive, impulse, instinct to get
and you see this. Yeah, and that same thing plays out all over the place, and you see it being encouraged. You see the leftists talking about removing unconscious bias and being aware of your privilege, the invisible knapsack, and all this stuff. They're teaching white people basically and maybe middle class people, but it's really aimed at white people. I think they're teaching white people to mistrust their instincts in every possible way, so that your life then becomes this constant process of examining yourself and chastising yourself for having instincts. Meantime, everyone else is quite free, I think, still to just go by instinct, and not to say that that's all they do, but they are free to do that. Whereas I think white people are constantly there's this intense pressure to just not trust your instincts at all, really.
And who is it that is granted the authority to hand down the edicts from upon high regarding what you can and can't think and what you can and can't say? It's not simply that the gap has been created between the signifier and the signified. These are technical terms from linguistics. They come from Saussure. It's this basic idea that, there is a thing that signifies, and there is that which it signifies. So you have the signifier and the signified. It was touched upon briefly in your discussion with on the offensive. And what's interesting to me is that that's not just a gap. It's a gap that is like the camel's nose in the tent. It's like the foot in the door. And it thrusts itself into that space between instinctive impulse and action. And there are so many dimensions of this that I'm really going to have to try to stay focused, because I can wind off everywhere with this in terms of showing you ways in which it applies. But I'd like to focus most on the idea of instinct and the natural world, because we have this idea, and that's my attack, which is forthcoming, which I've been working on now for more than a decade. A lot of people don't know I have an academic background as well. I dropped out of high school, but then I decided, fuck these people, I'm going to show them I can get in anyway. And so after that point, I was invited to participate in, putting papers together for academic publications. I've been invited to conferences. I did a big one hosted inside the Swedish Parliament in 2010, where I presented some stuff. Big for me, it wasn't that large of an audience attending. But it was an achievement on my part. I've been invited to the University of Leiden to present on 2 occasions. I've done editing work for academic publications, and I've published some stuff of my own. And I've been for quite some time looking at this idea of how they attack us with linguistics and what the alternative is. Everyone knows they're doing it, but it's so damn effective, and they use it everywhere. So if the right is going to come up onto the stage and do something with this, well, the question is how. You have to identify what's being done to you, but you also have to identify what the alternative is. And I think what I have discovered, and to the best of my knowledge, I have uniquely discovered it. It is the idea that, others have talked about it, but no one has taken it to the extent I have that I'm aware of. Writing comes first. Speech does not come first. Verbal, let us not say verbal, let's say communication with sound is shared across all sorts of life. I mean, you can hear cicadas, you can hear katydids, you can hear grasshoppers, you can also hear the squeaking of subterranean mammals, you can hear a tiger's roar, you can hear monkeys or apes getting territorial in the trees or on the ground with howling to indicate their territorial boundaries, or birds making all sorts of noise if a hawk comes in and it threatens them. So communication with sound is as old as life, as best we can tell, or almost as old as life. But the problem with communication with sound is that it doesn't stay. If I utter a word, how long does it hang in the air? It's gone as soon as I say it. So if you imagine a time before there were spoken words, you have to think about how we got to not having conventional meaning to having conventional meaning. And I don't want to get too esoteric with it, but let's just look at, when I say conventional, I mean it only has meaning because we agreed on it. It's arbitrary. And
Right.
that arbitrariness is at the core of what's been weaponized against us. I take a different view, which is that writing was the first thing that stayed so it could be shared and understood. If I look at a wolf track on the ground, I don't only have an indicator of wolf. I have an indicator of a specific wolf. Because normally with this sort of thing, you've got kind and instance. A mark can show you what category it falls into, and then there's an instance of it. So think about a tally mark. You make a hash mark for each thing you count. The hash mark is the covers the kind of what you're counting, and the tally mark is an instance of it. With tracks on the ground, you're actually reading a story. You can follow the wolf tracks, and you can say the wolf was here, and then it caught the scent of some deer, and now I can see how its tracks are now following behind the tracks of the deer. Then after a distance, you can look at the tracks on the ground and say, wow, this deer is obviously getting frightened because now there's a greater space between the tracks, and it looks like the wolf is in pursuit. And then you can get to where the wolves caught up with it, and you can see blood on the ground and the rest. That's a narrative. It exists in a line, just like our lines of text. We read them as we follow them. And as we follow them, we re-experience what was laid down by those marks. Now, you can say, as all of the leftists do, as all of the forces of progress do, that the spoken word came first and then there was text, and that writing is always an accident of language. It's always something that comes after language. Writing is something that could not exist if there was not speech first, because writing must be to capture speech, mustn't it? And they hold this to be a self-evident truth, and it's the root of everything. And by saying that speech came first, they say that arbitrariness came first. I would like to argue, and am arguing, and will continue to argue, so that the so-called right wing, so that nationalists, however they construe themselves, can be armed against all of this, that our first form of communication has nothing to do with arbitrariness. And taking quite a bit of excellent thinking from a Briton, he's now passed away, named Roy Harris. I take up his integrational semiology, which is the idea that you don't assess the value of anything that you're communicating with based on whether or not some speech circuit has communicated the meaning of the word from the speaker to the listener. The idea is instead that all of this signification that goes on around us is, the purpose of it is that it integrates and regulates our behavior so that individually we can integrate our own behavior over time. We can remember the past, imagine the future, and confront circumstances in the present, but we can also cooperate as a collective and do things together. So they talk about how words are communication. Well, what about when you're on a battlefield? There are all kinds of, I want to give you an example of integrating behavior, right? Because we have the idea of communication, a semiotics of communication, which goes with language and has arbitrariness at its heart. And then there's what I am offering, which is the idea that our fundamental models of meaning should be about integrating our individual behavior across the course of our lives in time, and our collective behavior, both in time and in space. Right? As an individual, if I'm an animal marking my territory, I have area for food caches where I buried them. I have areas for mating sites where I spawn and rear young. I have borders that I patrol, right? And the closer I am to the center of my territory, the more ferocious and effective I will be in defending it. This is mathematically shown with statistics. Animals, as they get driven into their own territory, they're much more ferocious and much more capable of defending. We also say, everybody knows that, you know, the advantage goes to the defenders, right? As soon as animals get beyond their territory, they start to get nervous. They start to look weird around, like take a cat to a new house that it hasn't been to before, and it's sniffing around to find the other marks in space that others have left to figure out if this area is contested and if it has to be worried. But after it's left enough marks, it feels comfortable. It can orient itself in time and space. Hold up the idea of writing on the page, which is the earth, which is all that exists around us, of landmarks and orientation to integrate behavior. Hold that up on one side, which I see as a form of writing, against this gaseous invertebrate concept of words and their ambiguity, and that they came first. And at the core of all human understanding and organization is arbitrariness. So hopefully I'm not getting too esoteric. I want to.
Let me get something clarified. Do you believe that the written word preceded the spoken word?
Animals were leaving tracks on the ground that could be read.
Yes,
long before anyone ever conceived a conventional word.
Yes, but conventional words, though. I mean,
conventional means we agree upon them. What is all of our language?
Yeah, well, spoken, verbal language, was that first written or was it first spoken? Like as the language that you and I are using right now, this kind of thing.
My hypothesis is that there first had to be some object that stayed over generations so that meaning could adhere to it. So think about this thing where I look at something, I come across this, and I happen to go, ooh, 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 pen. How does that stay so that everyone can agree on it, so that it can lock itself in the memory, so that it can become associated with that thing? The object itself, tokens, so the acorn representing the oak, the droppings of the animal we're hunting, which later, in, say, the Elizabethan period among the English were gathered together in horns called fumets, so that you could describe the animal that you were pursuing by showing its shit and tell what size it was, how healthy it was. The tracks on the ground that you read that showed tokens and environmental marks were the first things that we used to integrate our behavior, much as all these other species do. The fundamental thing that's going on with the utopians, with the forces of progress, is that they think human beings stand apart from nature. They're so anthropocentric that they believe that an enormous disjunction occurred with the emergence of man.
Well, you see this all over
who speak, and we share nothing with animals.
Yeah, you see this all over the place, that they think that we are uniquely different and separate, that our animal instincts can be suppressed and ignored. This is universal. I mean, like, they're male and female. They'll say, you know, there is no such thing as a man. But that's obviously flying in the face of any observation of the animal king, like the mammalian kingdom, where yes, there are males in each species and there are females in each species. I mean, it's, yeah, this is why I don't even know how they could be bothered to espouse the idea that, you know, maleness is purely a social, or masculinity is purely a social construct. I just don't. It's just incredible to me that they could say that.
And it's because they've planted arbitrariness at the roots of all our social conventions through the belief that man is different from animals, and that speech came first, and speech is arbitrary. Speech is the great thing that made possible the emergence of civilization, and then later they talk about writing. You know, writing is really what did it, but speech had to come first. No, we organized ourselves similar to the way that animals do.
Well, let me just clarify this. So words, the written word, I would think that the written word came after the spoken word.
It depends on how you define writing. If you define it as the academics do, which is writing proper, which means only those things that are known to capture and preserve spoken language qualify as writing. You see, they've defined everything else out of the picture. They call it proto-writing. They call it graphemes. They come up with every kind of word they can to push it out of the pale and not address it as what it actually is, which is writing. And by defining it that way, they can keep the notion, the erroneous notion, that speech came first.
So what else would you describe, would you categorize as words?
What else would I categorize as a word?
Yeah, what do you think preceded speech, spoken language?
A broader definition of writing, which I define as the marked environment. So let me give you an example.
Okay. If that's a good way to do it. Right now, it makes sense. Now, what you're saying, I can understand.
The first page is the space that surrounds you. The first writing surface is your environment, and it is not arbitrary. If I am an animal patrolling my perimeter and I come up on a tree and there's a scent mark because another dog in your environment has pissed on it, then I, as an animal, can come up to it and sort of sniff up the tree trunk. Anyone who's walked a dog has seen them do it. They find a place where another dog is pissed. As they patrol their route in a sequence, very much the same way each time they do it, because it has to do with their borders and their territory. Interesting things that are very much associated with nationalism, but not with progressives. We'll come back to this later. As the animal patrols its borders and its territories, it comes up on a tree trunk. And it says, here's an interesting scent signature. Is it recent? Or is it something that happened long ago? I can tell by the strength of the scent. That is like what we call chroning in programming, or a date stamp, or a year tag on our license plate, right? And the animal can sniff up and he can say, wow, this other animal's urine is way up here. It's like a foot higher than anything I'm pissing hits this tree, which means with no arbitrariness, whatever it was that passed in that place recently was there X amount of time ago. It's not arbitrary because the scent fades and the animal can tell how recent it is. And it's not arbitrary because it indicates the height. The larger animal actually pisses higher. Now, there are animals who will fake it. Pandas have been videotaped doing handstands, pissing against the tree trunk in order to seem much larger than they are. But this is a form of writing, and it happens in sequence. Again, we're reading it like letters, like following the marks on the ground. Anyone who thinks that some vocabulary appeared before people started paying attention to tracks on the ground is, forgive me, a fool. If you don't know how to hunt an animal, you're not going to eat. And let's take it another step. If you don't know how to recognize the environmental signs around you that indicate the presence of, for example, a Siberian tiger or some apex predator in your region, you are going to become a meal. So before our ever turned into fucking anything, we had to read the marked environment. And you know what's so strange? You know, topology aside, generally you're looking at a plane, if we want to reduce it to the simplest thing, rather like the plane of page. And you're looking at following the marks in a sequence. If you look at boustrophedon way back in the day with ancient Greek, they used to first write the Greek one way across the page, and then they drop down and go the other direction, making a mirror version. They call it boustrophedon, which means ox turning, because it's like an ox plowing back and forth across the field. Some languages, they'll go from top to bottom, and then from top to bottom again. They'll go left to right, right to left. But they're covering the ground, and they're reading the character order in sequence like tracks. Tracks always have a direction. Unless you're Hermes, who has stolen Apollo's cattle, who wears, who tricks by putting on a false set of footprints and walking in reverse. That's deception. That's another thing. Deception can occur with non-arbitrary communication, but it depends upon the idea that your marked environment has survival value. That's one of the things that I wanted to get at the beginning. Remember when I talked about how they insert that pause between you being confronted with something and you formulating a spoken or physical response?
Yes.
And how they get you all, I don't know what the fuck to do. They make war on instinct, and they stop it from functioning because men are something separate. Men, anthropocentrism dictates that we are different from all the animals. We have speech and writing, which they do not. We are the tabula rasa, and our great wise overlords can in future determine how best to arrange what we are to satisfy what is just and equitable. No, we have instinctive responses, and they come from reading our environment. I mean, look at the way in which we generally try to hide scent. We want to mask it with perfumes. We want to wash it away. You don't want to be close enough to smell someone unless you happen to be very close to them. That's a whole dimension that we have pushed to one side in favor of the visual, and yet it still continues to work on us beneath the surface because it's not arbitrary. You can smell sickness just like a cancer-sniffing dog can. Try to find the most beautiful person you can imagine, and if they smell like shit, you're not going to have a crush. Likewise, find someone who looks a little odd, but you love how they smell. It's instinctive and non-arbitrary.
So to summarize this then, how the hell do you summarize this? The contention from the left, let's just use that term for now. The contention from the left is that the world is arbitrary because the way we talk about it is arbitrary. The way we discuss it and represent it is arbitrary. And that is because speech is arbitrary. And the labels that we give to things are arbitrary. But you're saying that predating speech, there is a much less arbitrary form of communication which emerges directly from the environment and leaves signs of narrative stories.
That all have survival value if heeded.
Yes.
Much unlike the left.
Yes, yes. And right, okay, that is crucial. And that these narratives are undeniable because of the signs of themselves that they've left behind. So in other words, it is a valuable survival mechanism to be able to read the environment, to be able to read stored static messages in the environment.
And that and additionally, that's all very well said, but additionally I would add that when you are reading such things naturally, when a cat smells or a dog smells some weird shit in its patrolled environment, like it's inside the house and it's moving around and it's checking its little scent signatures in the corner before it turns 3 times to lie down, right? Checking, make sure everything's all right. Let me sniff your ass. What's going on? What's going on? Are we good? We're good? Okay. Right. But say it comes across this other scent because another dog's been there and it can't see it anymore. The dog's going to be a little bit freaked out. It's going to be like, oh, what the fuck? Where did this other thing come from? Right? It doesn't rationalize about it. It smells it and it has a response. It sees it and it has a response, which brings us back around to this point that you had raised earlier, which is that they insert this choke moment in us so that what would flow naturally is not permitted to do. This goes back to something that Frody said that is, for those who don't, I know you know, but Frody Midwittery stands for Guide to Culture. Right, great guy. He has an excellent point that he's made many times, which is that leftists are forced to expend ever more time and energy writing vast tomes and volumes in order to explain to you why it is that their shitty predictions that are never accurate should in fact be paid attention to.
Yes, because they're constantly running up against reality.
And they have to try to find some way to blather and blubber and explain to you why it is, again, you shouldn't trust your own fucking lying eyes. Why you should not allow the instinctive impression that you have received to move you without any recourse to rational imagination and prediction and the rest. You know, there are certain things where you can trust your instincts immediately. And in fact, you have to. If you've ever spent any time dealing with things outside of word-based reasoning, if a group of flamencos change their rhythm on you or are coming to a close of an improvisational moment, if you tried to think about what was coming, you'd be left off from the side and they'd be done and halfway home by the time you had sorted it all out. But if you turn off your rational mind, it gets the same thing with jazz musicians. You hear somebody, they're doing a riff, they're coming up to it, and somehow these experienced musicians all just end on the same instant because they can feel it. They don't have to get all, you know, tangled up in their underwear with, you know, well, what could this mean? And well, And so by inserting that gap of arbitrariness and self-doubt between the impression and the action, they corrupt and destroy our ability, both individually and collectively, to respond to the circumstances of our environment. So,
So then we need to rely on them to rescue us from that inevitable confusion that comes from there.
And they always have to step in with ever more complex rules for what it is we can or can't say. I mean, I looked at this thing with differently abled because that used to be the joke for handicapped people. You'd say differently abled, or, you know, it used to be crippled and then it was handicapped and then it was differently abled. Apparently what you're supposed to do now is talk about, I guess, people, I can't even follow it. It's something.
Is it something challenged?
No, it's worse. Now what you have to do is talk to them, talk about the person who actually has whatever the congenital condition is, as perfectly normal. And I guess it's not disabled, because they wouldn't accept that. But there's something basically where you talk about the person who has the condition normally, and then everyone else you talk about as being not this other thing, so as not to make them feel left out. And if you go to like the Brown University page on how to refer to this, I looked at it a couple of weeks ago. It's literally, it's a page and a half that you're supposed to memorize for how you're supposed to deal with this circumstance. Now think about that. You roll up on a person of color, you know, and you're just going to have a conversation with them. Next thing you know, you're a bumbling imbecile, because every natural response of yours has been shut down. It's like the old joke about, you know, where they show the bell curve, and they show like an idiot Wojak with a smashed in tricycle head on one side. And on the other side, they have, you know, the super Chad smart guy. And in the middle, they have the midwits. And, you know, the super Chad smart, it's like for women, you know, the busted head Wojak guy is going, they'll burn down your double wide, right? And over on the other hand, you got the super high IQ Chad who's saying, don't ever let them get the upper hand, you know? And then in the middle, you've got believe all women. And yeah, and now I'm not saying this is not all, they're wonderful women, but you take my point. There's this, and that curve shows you the largest number of people in the middle. And they're the ones who have had this falsehood, this meme virus, if you will, whatever it is.
They're the ones who are clever enough to understand the conditioning, but not clever enough to reject the conditioning and undo it.
Yes. I mean, there's a great one that Academic Agent put out in the last couple of days where he talked about this thing, never attribute. He's a bastard. He tries to throw it all on us in Gen X because he's sort of a millennial. He's trying to, you know, crap upon his elders, dirtbag Judas. But he came along and he has underscored, and I think quite rightly and quite perceptively, this statement about never attribute to malice, which you can disguise as, which you can explain as stupidity. And if you really dig at this, and this is what he did quite rightly, I think, and wisely, it's basically like you're stepping forward and saying, be rewarded for your stupidity while we continue our corrupt activities. Because if you say never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity, then that's like the word conspiracy theory. I mean, are you saying that there's a conspiracy? And it's like my friend said, Tim, the poor... The rich, only the poor conspire. The rich simply make plans. You know, there are all of these little fish traps. They're like fish weirs. You know, as the water flows down a stream, you make this sort of angled line of stakes, and the fish are driven to the central place where you catch them in the woven vines, and you get to pull them out. It's a fish weir. The current pushes them into it. And so these explanations that we have, this midwittery that becomes a little eddy that they all get trapped in, amounts to these silly little Skinner boxes, these little linguistic Skinner boxes.
Well, and worse than that, the midwit thinks gets excited about these things. You know, they think they're clever for invoking this trap, springing this on you, and you can only just, you know, despair for them, because, you know, I just find it incredibly tedious. But I know that the person coming up with it thinks that, yeah, they're really clever. Like when they say, well, you know, there's that hilarious meme about this. Foreign people who don't belong in your country commit crimes. I bet that people who do belong in your country commit crimes as well. It's brilliant because it's like, yeah, I've been in that conversation many times back in the day, and they always think it's so. They think they're great, and it's sorry.
No, not at all, because it's a good point. Abstract away all of the conventional meaning communicated by everything you just described. Like assume that whatever the sounds are that happened in that little vignette, because there are 100 different ones that you could pull out as an example. But in the end, all you see is a face looking at you and going, harp, 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 harp. Leaving all of that aside, the importance of the spoken language. Instead, look at what you see. It is someone who has been, for all intents and purposes, in terms of their agency in the world, utterly emasculated and they sit there before you chasing their own tail in this scrabble babble fucking Kabbalistic game of manipulation. And again, their instinctive reaction has been shut down.
Well, yeah, but of course, what you've got to remember is that the social mechanisms at play reward them for doing that. They reward them for chasing their own tail. You know, it's not just something that they're doing for the sake of it. It's they are rewarded socially for this behavior, whereas, of course, we are punished for not doing it.
Yes, on the surface. But if, once again, you step outside the framework of these words and their meaning and just look baldly at the survival value, look baldly at their prospects in terms of becoming an endangered species in their own territory, look baldly at the quality of their life, step outside language and look at the fundamental aspects of what animals use writing for. They use it to patrol their borders, to establish rank and hierarchy, to control territory, and to identify lineage and bloodline. Those have all been cast into the outer darkness. Or like, Gandalf, fighting with the Balrog, I smote him and he fell upon the face of the mountain. All those good old things associated with survival value have been cast into the outer darkness. So you can say that they're rewarded. You can say that they're rewarded, and they can feel rewarded as they chase their own tails in their minds. And yes, there are real consequences. You certainly have paid them. Nevertheless, look at it across any scale of time. They're gone. They're disappearing.
Yes, of course.
They're becoming nothing.
Yeah, in the short term, they're rewarded. In the short term, they get the affirmation of doing this. In the long term, they're wiping themselves out. It's kind of like that. Well, I don't need to. Yeah. There's a pretty gross metaphor that I could have gone into there, but to do with bulls being castrated. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. It wouldn't really add anything. So you know what I mean. It's something that they think is good for them at the time, but it actually isn't.
Yeah, and they end up against the wall with it. Basically, look at this idea of what we talked about with the arbitrariness of spoken language, and that is affirmed as axiomatic by all the linguisticians, right? And their idea, which is frankly preposterous, that all languages have equal value because all communities use them to organize their behavior and communicate the information they find necessary. Right? Okay.
And we love all communities, of course.
Yes, because it's all one level playing field. They have created a false, how shall I say this? There are things called internal, and this is something Roy Harris came up with, internal and external syntagmatics. Internal syntagmatics belong on the page. So there's an up and a down on the page. Syntagmatics, syntagm, it's linking together meaningful elements in a sequence, right? So on a page, you have internal syntagmatics with writing, which is recording speech, also other kinds of writing. But the internal syntagmatics is that you write this sentence and it goes from top to bottom and left to right. Out there in the big world, you have external syntagmatics, which is where you need to know what direction to orient. Is east where the sun comes up? Is west where it goes down? Do all maps organize around north? You can play games with organizing the page in a different way, and it might make it difficult to read if you fuck with internal syntagmatics. But with external syntagmatics, imagine a group of drunk teenagers coming to an intersection and rotating the street sign so that it points the roads in all directions, and suddenly you're disoriented and you can't do anything, right? They have convinced us that what we must focus on is internal syntagmatics, the games that they play with the written and spoken word, that we must be focused upon the page where we can get locked in these recursive loops. When you're reading a book and it's a little bit beyond you, just at the limits of what you can capably read, because you don't have a lot of background on it and you're trying to pay attention to it. But then you find, as you're getting a little bit more tired in bed, that your eye is just recursively looping the same paragraph. You're coming back to the sentence because you're like, I just didn't quite get this. Let me just start again. I'm not really getting the groove on this.
That actually happened to me just last night.
That is what they do to us with the doubt they insert into the ambiguity, which they affirm is existing always between a signifier and a signified. You get lost. But out there in 4D space, not 2D space of the page and their worship of the written word, which goes back to worship of the book, which goes back to religions of the book, which goes back to sacred texts, which we didn't have in the West until the arrival of Christianity, because we had a hexameter commemorating some Pythian pronouncement at Delphi, right? We had inscriptions saying X made me, right? But we didn't have the religion of the book and the idea of the text and of a scribe who was tasked with reading and interpreting the thing for all the rest of us. There were priests who had to read and interpret the signs, the events around us in the world. But then we brought in this import, which was the idea that it was all in a book and only certain people were allowed to read it and interpret it. And part of that, I think, has contributed to where we are today. How do I wrap this up? Good God, I'm going all over the place. 2D space over on one side with words and language. 4D space, which is the actual world. They can say arbitrary all day long until it steps on my survival value. I think that what we should do is focus upon space and time and how we orient in space and time, which is the form of writing that predates writing proper, having its associations with spoken language. We should focus on what actually gets used to help individual members of a species, as well as the species itself, survive. We need a semiotics, a theory of meaning that crosses back over to our animal inheritance and does not reject it and recognizes it as being present among us even today. If we continue to allow these scrabble-babble rearrangers of letters to manipulate us in the land of the arbitrary, and we do not set forth a point of orientation, then there is nothing that we can integrate and regulate and cooperate in our behavior with and around as a central point of orientation. Because fundamentally what they're doing is they're removing landmarks. Note that landmarks exist in the environment that actually surrounds us, and that landmarks are used to organize communities locally and to allow us to figure out where we're going when we're travel and how much of the night sky has passed by to how much time has passed, where the sun is in the sky, gnomon, sundial, clock tower, minaret. They all manage the times of the day and our location in space. If we don't embrace those things again, then we lose our connection to that which is real, which is not arbitrary, and we lose our focus upon things that have survival value.
Excellent. And I guess the distinction that's emerged here at the end is that those with, let's say, the powers that be, maintain, defy their own preaching and maintain a very non-arbitrary hold on things, whilst encouraging people into this, as you say, sort of playground of arbitrary drivel. That alone is a very interesting point and very pertinent point. Semiogogue, thank you for taking part in Millennial 2020. All right.